5 nights after my highway accident, I lay alone in my hospital room, still recovering from my injuries. Earlier that evening, my daughter had visited me, held my hand, and promised everything would be okay before leaving. But at 11:47 p.m., the door slowly opened. A police officer stepped inside, locked it, and covered my mouth. I froze, staring into his eyes until he whispered a name that made my entire world collapse. Some elements of this story are fictional, put together for storytelling purposes. The names and settings you'll encounter are coincidental, but the truth of what Conrad learned, that part you can carry with you long after this is over. Welcome to Wise Revenge. Glad you found your way here. If stories like this one speak to you, follow along so you never miss the next one. Before we go further, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is. There's something about hearing a story of loyalty and betrayal that hits differently depending on where you're sitting. One more thing before we begin: some elements of this story have been shaped for dramatic storytelling, and any resemblance to specific real persons or events is coincidental. What matters is the truth at the center of it. It wasn't heavy. That was the thing that got me standing there with it balanced in one hand, this ordinary cardboard box holding 35 years of my life's work, and every piece of evidence that would bring it all crashing down. I walked it through the main doors of Caldwell Freight Solutions and rode the elevator up to 2. Each breath still pulled against my ribs, a dull, persistent ache that took me straight back to those 3 months at Huntington Hospital. My doctor had made his feelings plain about returning too soon. I'd thanked him and meant none of it. Then I'd called Fletcher and told him to bring me my suit. When I got to the conference room, the door was shut. I angled my face toward the narrow strip of glass beside it and looked through. Renata was up at the head of the table, some slide behind her, throwing blue light across the wall. She had on the burgundy blazer I had bought her for her 30th birthday. Back straight. Voice low and steady. In that way, she had the kind of calm authority that used to fill me with something close to awe. I opened the door and went in. Every head turned and every voice stopped. Renata's arm, raised mid-gesture toward the screen, came slowly down. All the blood left her face at once, the way it does when the body gets ahead of the mind. Her mouth opened. Nothing came. Then Dad. Just that one word, and it broke somewhere in the middle of it like a floorboard giving under weight. You should be resting. I moved to the center of the table and put the box down. Quiet sound. Almost careful. Nothing that followed would be. I've been resting long enough, I told her. But I'm running ahead of the story. To understand what that box contained and what it meant, you have to go back to a Friday in September, to an ordinary morning on a stretch of the 10 freeway, where everything I had built came within inches of being gone. Caldwell Freight Solutions started in 1986 as nothing more than a single truck, a used Kenworth T680 dark green with a dent in the front bumper I never got around to fixing. 31 years old, $600 in my checking account, and a wife named Vivian who held more confidence in me than I had ever managed to hold in myself. The morning I signed for that truck, she put her hand on my arm and said, "You know how to drive, and you know how to work. The rest you'll figure out." She wasn't wrong. 15 years of pre-dawn mornings and hauling freight nobody else wanted to touch, and Caldwell grew one truck to 20 to 100 to the 230 vehicles running out of our City of Industry yard each week by the time Renata finished business school and came on board. California, Nevada, Arizona, clear out to New York. Manufacturers, distributors, medical suppliers, a dozen grocery chains. We were the company that showed up when we said we would. Vivian didn't live to see it. Spring of 2002, ovarian cancer, Renata just 11 years old. The doctors told us 8 months. She gave them 14 because giving in early was not something Vivian did. She was stubborn in all the right ways, squeezing out every day she could. The morning after we buried her, I sat down across from Renata at the kitchen table, still in her black dress. Eyes swollen, nearly shut, hands working a paper napkin over and over, folding and unfolding it, like she was trying to solve something with her fingers. "Are we going to be okay?" she asked. The tightness in my throat was so bad I had to turn my head. I found the window above the sink, the gray California light pressing through it, and I made myself a private promise before I turned back. "Yes," I said, "we're going to be okay." And for 22 years, I made that true every way I could. Nothing about the morning of the accident signaled what was coming. I had an 8:00 at the City of Industry Yard, and I was 10 minutes behind, which almost never happened. Onto the 10 heading east, at just after 7:40, the city still half asleep in the early September haze. The other truck never entered my field of vision. It came into the rear driver's side with a force that threw me across 2 lanes. What I remember is the sound first, not a crash, so much as a concussion, something that hit from every direction at once, and then the disorienting lurch of the world spinning wrong. I ended up against the concrete divider with the feeling that my chest had been rebuilt incorrectly. 3 broken ribs, as it turned out, and what the doctors called a mild head injury, though the headaches that ground through me for weeks afterward had nothing mild about them. By the time the first patrol unit reached the scene, the truck that hit me had vanished. No stop, no call, no note, just a streak of rubber and a fragment of tail light scattered on the asphalt. I was already in the ambulance, still foggy, still asking the paramedics about my vehicle. A young one with a calm manner told me it had held up fine. I said he didn't appreciate what that truck represented. He smiled like he figured the impact had rattled me. It hadn't. I was a man who had spent 35 years accounting for every piece of equipment he owned, and that kind of discipline doesn't loosen just because your ribs are in splinters and the road is still moving beneath you. At Huntington Hospital, they assigned me room 412 on the 4th floor, managed the pain, and told me not to move around unnecessarily. Dr. Hollis, the attending methodical man, chose his words. The way some people choose their steps, told me the ribs would knit on their own, but that I had to stay still. The scan had also picked up minor inflammation near the site of the head impact, which meant they'd be watching me for several more days. The nurse adjusting my IV asked if there was family to contact. "My daughter," I said. "Renata Caldwell." Numbers in my phone. What I couldn't have known, what I had no grounds to suspect at that moment, was that before Renata ever walked through that door, someone else had already come and gone. And come back again. When I opened my eyes the next morning, he was in the chair next to my bed. Not Renata, not a nurse. Not Dr. Hollis carrying his clipboard and his careful manner. Sterling Novak, dark slacks, collared shirt top button loose. A jacket that had probably run more than my first truck payment. Silver hair swept back from his forehead. He was holding a paper cup from the hospital cafeteria with the ease of a man who had arranged the morning exactly as he wanted it. When my eyes met his, the corners of his mouth lifted. "Chuck Conrad," he said. "You gave everyone quite a scare." The tightening in my chest had nothing to do with fractured bone. I worked myself slowly upright against the pillow, moving fast, meant a bolt of pain through my left side that dropped all thought, and looked at the man 3FT across from me, turning over in my head every occasion I might have given him my number. There wasn't one. I never had. "Sterling," I said. "How did you know which room I was in?" He raised one hand, small motion, unbothered. "Still know a few people here. Old contacts from my years with the State Transportation Office. These things get around. He leaned in and set the cup on the tray table next to the bed. I brought you something. That cafeteria's better than it looks. I left the coffee where he'd put it. That's considerate, I said. He settled back, one leg folded over the other. What you've built is genuinely remarkable, Conrad. Caldwell Freight means something in this city. When word reached me about the accident coming by, felt like the very least I could do. I kept my eyes on his face the whole time he was talking. Sterling Novak had always had a gift for this particular performance. The even tone, the words pitched just right, the way he could shape a conversation so that the other person felt obligated. I'd watched him run that same play 6 years earlier at a table in my own building, walking in with an acquisition offer and a smile that looked exactly like this one. I appreciate you making the trip, I said with all the care the moment required, but I don't want you going out of your way. No trouble whatsoever. He held my gaze a moment, then let his eyes drift around the room, the IV line, the monitors, the window facing west. The look of a man searching for something he already knows is there. Renata must be worried sick. She'll be here this afternoon. He nodded, unhurried. Of course. She's a capable young woman. You raised her well. He rose, then no rush to it, and smoothed his jacket with both hands. If there's anything you need, anything at all, I want you to reach out. The offer stands, Conrad. It always has. He meant the other one. The offer I had declined in 2016. He didn't say so, but it ran underneath every word he spoke like the idle of a truck engine 2 blocks off on a still street. I'll keep that in mind, I said. After he walked out, I lay there with my eyes on the ceiling for a long time. My ribs ached. My head throbbed at the base of my skull, where the collision had done its worst. But the thing I kept returning to, the thought I couldn't get clear of, was a single, quiet question. How had Sterling Novak known my room number before anyone had even called my daughter? Renata came at 2:30. The moment she appeared in the doorway, something in my chest contracted in a way that had nothing to do with fractured bones. She was still in her work clothes, navy blazer over a white blouse, dark hair pulled back tight. But the skin around her eyes was red, and her mascara had smeared slightly under the left one, the way it does when you've been crying and tried to fix it without a proper mirror. She crossed the room in 4 quick steps and pressed her cheek against mine, keeping her weight off my chest. Dad. The word came out broken. She pulled back and cupped my face in both her hands, her eyes moving over me the way you check something you're afraid might be damaged. I came as fast as I could. The traffic on the 110 was... Her voice broke again, and she sealed her lips together hard, holding herself in place. I should have been here this morning. I'm so sorry. Hey. I lifted my hand and laid it over hers. Her fingers were shaking. I'm all right. I'm right here. You have 3 broken ribs, Dad. I've had worse. You have not had worse. She made a sound, half laugh, half sob, and pressed the back of her hand to her mouth for a moment. Then she dragged the visitor's chair up close and sat elbows on her knees, leaning in. Tell me exactly what the doctor said. Everything. I walked her through Dr. Hollis's assessment. The scan findings, how long the ribs would need to mend, what the monitoring protocol for the head injury looked like. Renata took in every word, the way she had always received information that mattered, with her full attention, cutting in at the right moments with 2 or 3 precise questions. When I finished, she let out a slow breath and rubbed the back of her neck. What about the driver, she said. The one who hit you. He left the scene. The police are working on it. Something moved across her jaw, a tightening quick and controlled, gone almost before it registered. The way fathers notice things. You can't help it. You've been reading your child's face for so long it becomes involuntary. like checking the weather by the color of the light. "I'll make some calls," she said. "See if I can get someone to follow up." "You don't need to do that." "I want to." She reached over and took my hand, and her grip was solid and warm. "I'm going to handle things while you're here. The company, the contracts, whatever needs attention. None of that should be on your mind. Renata, Dad." She looked at me steadily, the tears tucked away now behind something that looked like resolve. "Let me do this. Please. You've held everything together my entire life. Let me carry it for once." I looked at her. This woman I had watched grow from an 11-year-old, sitting at a kitchen table in a black dress working a paper napkin between her hands, because she needed something to do with them. And something eased in me that had no relation to broken ribs. "All right," I said. "We can talk about it." She squeezed my hand. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a document organizer I recognized from my own desk. She'd brought paperwork. She'd come ready. What I understand now, looking back, is what I failed to see in that moment. I was too relieved to catch it. She hadn't asked what I needed. She had told me what she intended to do. Later, after Renata had gone home and the ward settled into its nighttime quiet, I lay in the dark, thinking about Sterling Novak in that chair that morning, the way his eyes had worked the room, the easy smile, the paper cup of coffee. I'd never touched the fact that he had arrived before my own daughter had even been called. I turned it over for a long time. Then I reached for the nightstand drawer and checked that my phone was still where I'd left it. It was. And so was everything else I had made a point of keeping close. On the 5th night, sleep wouldn't come. That wasn't new. The pain medication took the sharpest edge off the rib fractures, but it left me in a strange middle state, thoughts drifting too slowly to follow, too fast to release. I lay in the dark of room 412 and listened to the hospital breathing around me, a cart rolling somewhere down the hall, the low hum of the ventilation voices murmuring at the nurse's station. The clock on the wall read 11:47 when I heard the door. Not a knock. Not the familiar nudge of the nurse checking vitals. This was different, measured, deliberate. The handle turned with the precision of someone working hard not to make noise, and the door moved inward on its hinges without a sound. I kept my eyes nearly shut, just enough of a gap to see. The man who entered was broad across the shoulders, moving with the flat ease of someone accustomed to walking into rooms uninvited. Dark blue uniform, LAPD patch on the left shoulder. He stopped just inside the doorway and let his eyes adjust to the low glow of the monitoring equipment. Then he turned and locked the door behind him. My heart hit the inside of my chest so hard, I was certain the monitor would spike and pull someone in from the hallway. I made myself breathe slowly in through the nose, out through the mouth, the technique Dr. Hollis had given me for managing pain without bracing my damaged ribs. The man crossed the room in 8 steps and leaned over the bed. His hand came down across my mouth before I had drawn a full breath. The pressure was deliberate enough to hold, not enough to harm. His face was close enough that I could make out the lines around his eyes and the careful emptiness he wore like a second uniform. "Don't make a sound," he said, just above a whisper, controlled. "I'm not here to hurt you, Mr. Hayes. I need you to listen to me." I grabbed his wrist with both hands. Not because I thought I could overpower him. 3 cracked ribs and 2 days of hospital food were not going to win that, but because it was what a frightened man would do, and I needed him to read me as frightened. I was not frightened. I was paying close attention. "My name is Wade Fairfax," he said. "I'm with LAPD Commercial Transport Division, and there's something you need to understand before it's too late." He glanced back at the door, then returned to my face. "Your daughter is not managing your company, Mr. Hayes. She is dismantling it." He lifted his hand from my mouth, slowly watching my eyes. I let my face do the work. eyes wide, jaw loose, the particular blankness of a man whose footing has just been taken out from under him. 35 years of sitting across from people at negotiating tables and loading docks and in courtrooms had taught me exactly what shock looked like on a face. I gave him all of it. "So what are you talking about?" I said, and I let just enough tremor into my voice. "Renata Caldwell has been redirecting freight contracts to outside operators connected to a private investment group." He straightened up, and his eyes began to move. And that was it, the tell I'd been waiting for. His gaze swept the room the way it does when a man is hunting for something he already knows exists. The nightstand, the closet, the tray table. "She's been doing it since the day you were admitted. By the time they discharge you, the company's most valuable shipping lanes will belong to someone else." "That can't be right," I said. "Renata wouldn't. She already has." His eyes went to the nightstand drawer, held there a half-second longer than they should have. "Is there anything in this room that belongs to the company documents? A laptop, a storage device of any kind?" And there it was. He hadn't come to warn me. He'd come to find something. The warning was just the wrapping, useful, convincing, exactly alarming enough to keep my hands occupied and my eyes on his face while he catalogued every surface in the room. I let my hands fall from his wrist, pressed them flat against the mattress, and let my shoulders drop, the posture of a man caving under the weight of bad news. "I don't keep work things here," I said. "My daughter brought some paperwork yesterday, but she took it back home with her." Something shifted behind his eyes. Not quite disappointment, more like a quick readjustment. He moved to the nightstand and pulled the drawer open with a smooth, unhurried motion, the way someone moves when they've done this before, and expect to find what they're after. What he found was my reading glasses, a paperback, 2 packs of crackers the nurse had left me, and my phone. He picked the phone up, checked the screen, set it back down. Then he moved to the small closet beside the bathroom and opened it. My street clothes hung on the single rod, the shirt and jeans I'd had on when the ambulance brought me in. He checked the jacket pockets. He checked the shelf above. He crouched and examined the closet floor. Nothing. He stood and turned back to face me. Whatever he had come looking for in room 412 wasn't here, and he was skilled enough to know that pushing further would cost him more than it gained. "I'm going to give you a number," he said, drawing a card from his breast pocket and placing it on the tray table. "If you come across anything, documents, records, anything that feels out of place, you call me directly. Not the main line. This number." He tapped the card twice with 2 fingers. "Do you understand?" "Yes," I said. My voice stayed level, my hands stayed flat. "I understand." He held my gaze for 3 full seconds. Then he crossed to the door, unlocked it, and walked out into the hallway without another word. I waited until his footsteps had gone quiet. Then I let out a long, measured breath that sent pain rippling through my left side and fixed my eyes on the ceiling of room 412. Officer Wade Fairfax of the LAPD Commercial Transport Division had just broken into a hospital room, delivered a warning about my daughter, and searched every surface he could reach, while making it look like something other than a search. He'd checked the nightstand, the closet, my jacket pockets, my phone. He had not looked in the one place that mattered. 3 days before the accident on the 10 freeway, I had spotted something wrong in the routing data for our September freight schedule. I didn't know what I was looking at yet, but I had learned a long time ago that when your own numbers don't add up, you don't sit with the question. You copy the data, you secure it somewhere, and you work out the rest from there. I had put everything onto a small drive. The morning before the accident, I had handed that drive to Lionel Haig, my chief accountant of 22 years, with instructions to keep it somewhere only he could find. Officer Fairfax had gone over every corner of this room and come up empty, which told me 2 things. First, that whoever had sent him didn't know about Lionel. Second, that I had roughly 1 day before they started looking with more conviction. I reached over and picked up the business card from the tray table, turned it once between my fingers. Then I set it face down on the nightstand, lifted my phone, and went to my contacts. I did not dial the number on the card. I called Lionel. He picked up on the second ring. I kept my voice low and my words tight. "The drive is safe," I said. "Don't move it. Don't mention it to anyone. And starting tomorrow, I need you to watch everything." She brought coffee. That was the first thing I noticed when Renata walked in the next morning. The paper cup from the place on the corner of Larchmont and Beverly, the one with the green awning I had been stopping at every morning for the better part of 20 years. Dark roast, 2 sugars, a splash of oat milk. She had remembered. Of course she had. She had grown up watching me drink it. I figured the hospital stuff was terrible, she said, setting the cup on the tray table and leaning in to kiss my forehead. Her hair carried the same shampoo she'd used since college, something with lavender in it, that Vivian had loved, and that Renata had kept on using long after her mother was gone. "How did you sleep?" "Well enough," I said. That wasn't entirely true. I had lain awake most of the night after my call with Lionel, turning things over, the way you turn a stone with your boot to see what's underneath. But Renata didn't need to know that. Not yet. Not until I had a clearer picture of what I was dealing with. She pulled the chair alongside the bed and sat curling both hands around her cup. In the morning light through the window, I could see the faint shadows beneath her eyes. She hadn't slept much either. She'd covered them with makeup and done a decent job of it. But I had been reading my daughter's face for 39 years. I knew the difference. "I spoke with Kevin Briley this morning," she said. Kevin was our operations manager, dependable, precise, 11 years with the company. He's going to cover the Pacific Southwest contracts while you're out. I've also rescheduled the November carrier review. We can push it to January without losing any ground. "That's good thinking," I said. She nodded, studying her coffee. Then, in a tone so offhand, it nearly slipped past me. "I've also been talking with some of the regional partners about restructuring a few of the smaller shipping lanes. Just streamlining, nothing major." I wrapped both hands around the warm paper cup she'd brought and looked at my daughter's face. She was looking toward the window. Her expression was easy open, a woman describing routine business. Nothing in her voice or the way she held herself suggested she'd said anything beyond what it sounded like. But I had built Caldwell Freight from nothing. I knew every lane we ran, every contract we held, every partner we dealt with. And the regional shipping lanes Renata was referring to were not small. They were the backbone of our California to New York corridor, the contracts that kept 230 trucks on the road and 340 employees with a paycheck. "Which lanes?" I asked. She looked back at me and smiled. "Just the secondary connectors. I'll put together a summary for you to look over once you're feeling better." I nodded and let it rest. Because that is what a worn-down, injured man who trusted his daughter without reservation would do. I have spent a great deal of time in the month since thinking about the specific kind of blindness that love creates. Not the foolish variety. Not the blindness of someone who ignores plain evidence because he'd rather not face it. The other kind, the kind that grows from watching a frightened 11-year-old girl become a sharp, capable woman, and believing with everything in you that the person you raised is still at her core the person you know. Vivian used to say that the most dangerous thing about love was how rational it made irrational faith seem. She said it about her own mother, who had stayed in a hard marriage for 40 years because she couldn't let go of the belief that the man she'd wed at 22 was still somewhere inside him. But I've come to believe she was talking about all of us, about the particular mathematics of love, where the accumulated history of a relationship becomes its own form of proof evidence that the person in front of you is who you've always believed them to be. I had 39 years of that evidence when it came to Renata. I remembered the morning she was born, the doctor placing her in my arms, and me looking down at this small, red-faced, furiously unhappy person and feeling something crack open in my chest that I hadn't known was sealed shut. I remembered teaching her to ride a bicycle in the parking lot of our school on a Saturday morning, jogging alongside her with one hand on the back of the seat, then releasing it, watching her wobble and right herself and wobble again, and somehow, impossibly, stay up. I remembered the year after Vivian died when Renata was 12 and had quietly decided she was done crying because crying didn't accomplish anything and she had things to attend to. She had taken to making lists, groceries, homework, household repairs, and leaving them on the kitchen table for me to find each morning, written out in her careful 12-year-old hand. I would read them and feel my heart break and stitch itself back together in the same breath. She had been trying to look after me even then. At 12 years old, 6 months after losing her mother, she had been checking to make sure I was still standing. How do you measure that against a suspicious set of numbers and a freight schedule? How do you hold both things in your mind at the same time and determine which one is true? She stayed 2 hours that morning. We talked about ordinary things, the company, the construction that had started near my house, a film she'd caught with a friend the week before the accident. She was warm and easy funny, the way she'd always been, with a dry delivery and a gift for isolating the one absurd detail hiding inside an otherwise unremarkable story. When she got up to leave, she squeezed my hand and said she'd be back the following evening. Meetings in the afternoon she couldn't shift, but she'd come straight from the office. "Don't let them talk you into the meatloaf," she said, tilting her head toward the hallway where a food cart was making its rounds. "I had it the last time I was here visiting someone. It ought to be classified as a controlled substance." I laughed. It pulled at my ribs. I didn't care. After she left, I sat there with the empty coffee cup turning in my hands and let the full weight of everything settle over me. The call with Lionel the night before. Officer Fairfax and his careful hands working through every corner of this room. Sterling Novak and his patient smile the way he'd said the offer stands Conrad, as though 6 years hadn't gone by, and nothing between us had shifted. My throat closed until I had to press my lips together and fix my eyes on the pale Los Angeles sky outside the window. I had made Vivian a promise the morning after her funeral that I would always be Renata's safe place. 22 years later, I was lying in a hospital bed trying to work out whether my daughter had arranged the accident that put me there. The pain in my ribs was nothing set against that. I was still there turning the empty cup in my hands when my phone buzzed on the nightstand. I looked at the screen. Lionel Haig calling from his office line, the one he only used when he didn't want the call appearing in his personal records. I picked up before the second ring had finished. Conrad." His voice was low and wound tight in a way I hadn't heard from him in 22 years. Not since the morning his wife got her diagnosis, and he'd rung me from a hospital parking lot, not knowing who else to call. "I need you to listen carefully. Something is wrong with the September numbers. Not wrong like a data entry mistake. Wrong like someone went back in and altered them after the fact." My grip on the phone tightened until I could feel the edges of the case biting into my palm. "How many entries?" 14 routing changes, all of them in the last 10 days. He paused. I heard him exhale slowly, the way a man breathes out when he's setting something heavy down. "And Conrad. The authorization codes on every single one of them belong to Renata." I set the phone on the nightstand and stared at it. 14 routing changes. All of them carrying Renata's authorization codes. All made in the 10 days since I'd been admitted to room 412. I knew what had to happen next. The question was how to move without letting anyone see that I had started. I picked the phone back up and scrolled to a number I hadn't dialed in nearly 2 years. It rang 3 times before a familiar voice came through, rough at the edges, the way a voice gets after 20 years of early mornings and late nights behind the wheel, a habit that doesn't quite leave a man even after he's retired. "Conrad Caldwell," Fletcher Grady said. "You're either calling to apologize for that terrible hand of poker you played in Reno in '97 or something's wrong." Despite everything, I felt the corner of my mouth move. "Something's wrong, Fletcher." "Figured." I heard him settle back the specific creak of the old canvas chair he kept on his back porch in Visalia. "Talk to me." I kept it brief. That was always the way with Fletcher. He didn't need the whole picture laid out for him, just the load-bearing lines. I told him about the accident, the hospital, the 14 routing changes Lionel had found. I left out Officer Fairfax. Not yet. Some things you hold close until you're certain who's within earshot. "I need you to pull the freight records for September," I said quietly. "Everything moving in and out of the City of Industry yard, cross-reference it against the actual delivery confirmations, and tell me where the numbers stop matching." Fletcher was quiet for a beat. Not the silence of a man working it through, the silence of a man who'd already worked it through and was being deliberate with his words. "You know what you're describing." "I know. And you know who you're describing it about." My chest tightened. My ribs ached. "I know that too," I said. "That's why I'm calling you and not anyone else." "All right." His voice was steady and sure, the same voice that had talked me through a blown transmission on a 2-lane stretch of Nevada highway 30 years ago. "Give me 48 hours. After the call ended, I lay back and watched the ceiling. The morning light had moved, tracking slowly across the floor, the way light moves in a hospital room when you have nothing to do but observe it. Renata was coming back that afternoon. I had roughly 4 hours to become a different version of myself, the one she needed to believe in. A man who was worn out and sore and glad to have his daughter handling things. A man with no particular interest in why the September numbers looked the way they did or who had changed them or what it meant. A man content to rest and let someone else manage the details. I had built a company from the ground up by never letting a detail slip past me. Now I had to convince my daughter I'd lost the habit. When Renata arrived at 3:00, I was sitting up in bed with a word search I had not made any progress on and a half-eaten cup of Jell-O on the tray table beside me. I had specifically asked the nurse for the Jell-O because it was the sort of thing a man requests when he has stopped worrying about nutrition or appearances. "Dad." Renata set her bag down and came to the bedside, pressing her palm to my forehead, the way she used to check me for fever back when she was 12 and trying to hold everything together. "You look tired." "I am tired," I said. That part was true. These medications make it hard to think straight. That part was less so, but near enough. She drew the chair close and opened her laptop. "I want to walk you through a few things just to keep you in the loop." She turned the screen toward me. I looked at it with the unfocused gaze of a man making an effort he couldn't quite sustain. "The regional restructuring I mentioned," she said, gesturing to a column of figures. "I've been working with some of our partners on shifting a few of the secondary lanes over to more efficient operators. It should open up capacity on the core routes." I squinted at the screen. "Which secondary lanes?" "The connector runs from San Bernardino out to the Nevada border. The Central Valley feeders." She said it without a beat of hesitation. "Nothing that touches the main corridors." I knew she had it wrong. The San Bernardino connector and the Central Valley feeders weren't secondary routes. They were arteries, the ones that fed everything upstream. Pull them, and the core routes would shed 20% of their incoming volume inside of 60 days. Either she didn't understand, that which was impossible given her MBA and 4 years inside the company, or she was banking on me not understanding it. I rubbed my eyes with the back of my hand. "Sounds like you've got it under control," I said. She smiled, warm, relieved. "I do. You just focus on getting better." I gave a slow nod and dropped my eyes back to the word search sitting in my lap. 7 across a word for betrayal, 6 letters. I already knew what went there. I just wasn't ready to fill it in. That evening, Fletcher called back earlier than I'd expected. The easy warmth he'd had in the morning was gone. What replaced it was the flat, measured tone of a man carrying news he wishes he didn't have to deliver. "Conrad," he said, "I found the name of the company that owns the truck that hit you. You need to sit down for this." I was already sitting up when Fletcher said it. "Sierra Pacific Transport, LLC," he said, "registered in Nevada. The listed agent is a law firm in Las Vegas, Nevada, that handles anonymous entity formation. They represent something like 400 shell companies out of the same address, a standard arrangement for someone who doesn't want their name attached to a vehicle registration." I pressed the phone hard against my ear and held very still. Outside the window of room 412, the Los Angeles sky had gone the deep orange of early evening, the kind of color that looks beautiful right up until you realize you've been staring at it too long without blinking. "Who owns it?" I asked. "That's the part you need to sit down for." Fletcher's voice had none of its usual ease. Every word was deliberate, placed with care, the way you set your feet on ground you don't trust. "The beneficial owner of Sierra Pacific Transport, traced through 2 layers of nominee directors, and a Delaware holding company, is a trust administered on behalf of Renata Christine Caldwell." The room didn't spin. I want to be clear about that, because people expect a moment like this to arrive as something physical, the floor falling away, the walls pressing in. It was nothing like that. It felt like the opposite. Like everything went very still, very quiet, very small. And I was sitting at the center of it, phone in hand, 3 cracked ribs, and the sudden and absolute understanding that the person I had built everything for had put me in this bed. "Conrad." Fletcher's voice came through rough and careful. "You still there?" "I'm here," I said. "I need you to know I ran this 4 times before I called you. 4 separate traces through 4 different databases. Same result every time. I believe you. I know you do." A long pause. I heard him exhale the breath of a man who has delivered terrible news before and understands there's nothing left to do but wait it out. "I'm sorry, Conrad. I genuinely am." I set the phone down on the mattress without ending the call and looked at my hands. They were exactly what they'd always been. Wide palms, calloused fingers, the scar across my left thumb from a cargo strap that snapped on a loading dock in Stockton in 1992. 35 years of work written right into the skin. I had used these hands to build something real, something that employed 340 people, moved freight across 5 states, and carried a reputation I had never once let slip. And my daughter had used it to put me in a hospital bed. I picked the phone back up. "Fletcher, how long would it take to build a case, a real one, the kind that holds in court? Depends what we're building it with." His voice steadied, shifting into the practical register of a man who had spent 2 decades running down commercial transport violations. "Right now I've got corporate records and a vehicle registration. That's a thread, not a rope. To make it a rope, I need financial records, routing data, and something that ties the shell company to an actual transaction, something tangible." "Lionel has the drive," I said. "He's been pulling together financial records for the past 3 months. Then I need Lionel." A pause. "And Conrad, I have to be straight with you. I'm a retired FMCSA inspector. I can pull records and trace registrations, but I can't walk this into a federal courtroom by myself. If what you're describing is what I think it is, we're going to need the FBI in this at some point. The question is when." "Not yet," I said. "Not until we know the full shape of it. If we move too soon and they find out we're coming, everything vanishes. Agreed, and another pause. What are you going to do in the meantime? I looked at the door of room 412. Through this narrow window beside the frame, I could see the hallway, the nurse's station, the soft institutional lighting, and orderly pushing a cart towards the elevator. Same thing I've been doing, I said. Nothing as far as anyone can tell. After I ended the call with Fletcher, I lay in the dark for a long time. I didn't turn the television on. I didn't pick up the word search from the nightstand. I just lay there and let myself carry the full weight of what I now knew, because I'd learned long ago that the only way to bear something heavy is to pick it up the right way first. I thought about the morning I'd taught Renata to drive a truck. She was 16, and I'd taken her to the yard on a Saturday morning before any of the crew showed up. She'd been terrified and furious at herself for being terrified, which was the most Renata thing imaginable. She ground the gears twice, stalled the engine once, and then on the fourth try brought the rig around in a clean, wide arc along the perimeter of the yard without clipping a single cone. She'd looked over at me with an expression I have never forgotten, not quite pride, but something right next to it. The look of someone who has just found out they can do something they weren't sure they could. Watching her face in that moment, I thought there was nothing in the world I wouldn't do for this person. I still believed that. And that was what I couldn't reconcile lying there in room 412 with the evidence stacked on one side and 39 years stacked on the other. The love hadn't gone anywhere. It was still there, filling the same space it always had. It just hurt differently now. My phone buzzed against the mattress. I looked at the screen. Renata calling from her cell. My thumb hovered over the answer button for 2 full seconds. Then I pressed it. Dad. Her voice was warm and easy. The voice of a woman who'd put in a long day and was calling to check on her father. How are you feeling? Did you eat anything real for dinner? I closed my eyes, pressed my lips together until the tightness in my throat passed. I had the chicken, I said. It wasn't bad. That's a low bar, but I'll take it. She laughed softly. I'm going to come by tomorrow morning. I have some paperwork I need you to look at. All right, I said. I'll be here. Obviously, you'll be there, Dad. You're in the hospital, right? I let out a breath I shaped into something that resembled a laugh. Good night, Renata. Good night. Get some sleep. I set the phone down when the call ended, stared at the ceiling, felt the ache in my ribs spread out until it wasn't a physical thing anymore, until it was simply the feeling of a man who has just told his daughter good night while knowing what he knows. That was the first time in my life I had ever lied to Renata by telling her the truth. I picked up the phone one more time and sent Lionel a single text. Call Fletcher tomorrow. He needs the records. Then I closed my eyes and waited for morning. Fletcher called back on a Tuesday morning, 48 Sodarum. 8 hours after I'd sent Lionel to him with the records. I knew from the first word he said that it was bad. Not because his voice was alarmed. Fletcher Grady did not do that. In 30 years of knowing Fletcher Grady, I had never once heard alarm in his voice. That wasn't how he operated. What he did instead, when the news was bad enough, was compress. Pull everything inward. Each word placed down with the deliberate care of someone working around something that could detonate. Sterling Novak, he said. I shut my eyes and pushed my head back into the pillow. That name didn't land easy. It settled into my chest the way something dense and cold settles slow, final, spreading out from the center. Talk to me, I said. Novak Capital Group out of Laguna Beach, private investment firm now. But the 11 years before that, he spent as a senior administrator inside the California Department of Transportation Commercial Carrier Oversight. Fletcher let that sit a moment. The man came up through the freight world, Conrad, he's got the rule book memorized, every regulation, every gap in enforcement, every place the system doesn't look. He can read a company like yours the way a mechanic reads an engine. He knows where it's vulnerable before you've opened the hood. I had already figured most of that. What I didn't have was the thread connecting him to Renata. How did he find his way to her, I asked. Fletcher pulled in a slow breath. From everything Lionel put together, this wasn't a chance encounter. Novak chose her. The Southern California Logistics Association annual dinner spring of 2022. Renata was there on behalf of Caldwell Freight. By the time he walked across that room to shake her hand, he had already mapped the company ownership structure, family ties, all of it. He knew who she was going in. Spring of 2022. I turned that over. Renata had mentioned that dinner when she got home. Said she'd met someone, a man who actually spoke the language, who understood what the business really was. She'd said it once and moved on, and I hadn't pressed her. Hadn't thought to ask the name. I hadn't thought to ask the name. I felt my grip on the phone go tight, the pull of tendons along the back of my hand. She didn't know who he was, I said. Less a question than a thing I needed to say out loud. Not a clue, Fletcher said. He kept Caldwell Freight out of those early conversations entirely. Came at her as a general industry investor, nothing more. Took him 6 months of steady contact before he ever let your company's name enter the picture. And by the time Renata saw where it was heading, she was already far enough in that walking back wasn't simple. I found myself thinking about Sterling Novak in that chair at the foot of my hospital bed. The unhurried smile, the paper cup, the way he'd said the offer, stands Conrad like a man who had simply been keeping a seat warm. Like 6 years was a reasonable thing to wait, and it had been. He had waited 6 years. My first encounter with Sterling Novak was January of 2016, second-floor conference room, the Caldwell Freight Building in City of Industry. 2 associates flanked him, leather portfolio on the table and that specific variety of self-possession that certain men carry into rooms, the kind that tells you they've already decided how this ends before anyone sat down. I'll say this much for him, he'd done his work. Route structure, client relationships, the industry figures, he had it all. Framed the acquisition like an act of generosity, as though Caldwell Freight ought to be grateful someone of his standing was willing to make the offer. The number on this table was 40% below market. When I said no, I watched something pass between his 2 associates. A quick, sidelong look, the look of people who had scenario-planned this meeting in detail, but hadn't genuinely accounted for that particular word. Novak himself didn't glance at either of them. He looked straight at me, expression unchanged. I think you may be underestimating what the next 5 years look like for independent carriers your size, he said. I told him I'd been underestimated before. Said it had generally worked out fine. He kept his eyes on me a beat past comfortable. Then he gathered the portfolio, rose from his chair, and did up his jacket button. He went around and shook each associate's hand in turn. Mine he left alone. He crossed to the door and walked out, and they followed him. And that was the last I'd seen of Sterling Novak until he materialized in my hospital room that September. 6 years of quiet, 6 years of patience, 6 years of circling, watching, looking for a different door. The door he found had been my daughter, Conrad. Fletcher's voice drew me back. There's more. I braced. Go on. The routing changes Lionel flagged back in September. I ran them against the ELD data pulled from the trucks on those runs. ELD, electronic logging device, the federally mandated GPS tracking system covering all commercial vehicles under 49 CFR Part 395. Continuous automatic tamper-proof. Every mile, every stop on record. 3 of those routes logged stops at facilities that don't appear anywhere in our client contracts. A warehouse out in Paris in the Inland Empire. a cold storage unit in a commercial district in Brooklyn, New York. The bottom dropped out of my stomach. What was moving through those locations? The ELD can't tell me that. I can give you the where and the how long. What was transferred that's beyond what the data shows. He paused. But Conrad, you take unauthorized stops at unlisted sites, add falsified manifests, add a shell company that traces back to your daughter, and this is no longer a story about somebody skimming from the books. I heard what he wasn't putting into words. We're in federal territory. Federal territory, he said. And that's why this next part matters. The moment this package lands on the FBI's desk, it leaves our hands. They run their own clock, their own playbook, and they don't check in before they move. Understood, I said. But we're not ready for that step. I need something answered first. What's that? I need to understand whether Renata knew what she was signing on to, I said, or whether Novak constructed it in a way that left her feeling she had no road out. Silence stretched across the line. Then Fletcher, quiet and careful, that matters to you. She's my daughter, I said. It will always matter. I ended the call and stayed there with everything he'd given me. Sterling Novak had spent 6 years positioning himself, identified the one person who held the keys to what he wanted, and assembled something methodical around her. Whether Renata had stepped into it with clear eyes or been walked into a corner she couldn't see coming, whether that distinction even held anymore, was a question I wasn't ready to sit down with yet. Then my phone buzzed against the mattress. A text from Lionel. One of the logistics coordinators reached out to me tonight. Her name is Cecily Dunbar. Says she needs to talk. Conrad, I think she's got something. Lionel rang me at 7 the next morning before breakfast trays had gone around the 4th floor. I met with her, he said. Cecily Dunbar, 3 years with the company logistics coordinator over at the City of Industry Yard. Reliable, keeps to herself. Gets in before anyone else and rarely leaves first. He paused. Conrad, the woman is frightened. Not nervous frightened. But she's willing to talk. Get it set up, I said. Off-site. Already handled. There's a coffee shop 2 blocks from the yard on Valley Boulevard. I told her 8:30. I spent that hour flat on my back in room 412, eyes on the ceiling, thinking about a 29-year-old woman 3 years into a job she'd probably believed in, now carrying weight that was never meant for her. I didn't yet know what Cecily Dunbar had seen, but fear reads the same regardless of who's describing it, even relayed, even filtered through Lionel's measured delivery. Really scared. That told me enough about the shape of what was coming. Lionel called back at 10:15. I heard it before he said a word, in the way he breathed out when the line connected. The specific gravity that takes up residence in a person after they've absorbed something they can't set back down. He'd made it to the Valley Boulevard coffee shop, sat across from Cecily Dunbar, heard everything she had to say, and now he was in his car behind the Caldwell freight yard, reaching me on his office line, because no other line felt safe enough. Start at the beginning, I said. 6 weeks ago, Lionel said. Renata called Cecily into her office, said there were changes coming to the manifest documentation process, new formatting requirements tied to a partner company. Cecily was to start using a revised template for a particular batch of shipments, roughly 20% of total volume. The template rewrote the cargo description fields. I shut my eyes. Rewrote them how industrial cleaning supplies became general freight. Chemical compounds became equipment components. Hazardous material classifications had been stripped out completely. His voice was flat and controlled the voice of a man who recites facts, because that's the only way to keep himself from coming apart. Cecily hadn't understood what she was looking at, not at first. She assumed it was a routine compliance update. She ran the first batch through the revised template, filed everything, and then went back and looked more carefully at what she had actually submitted. Lionel exhaled. Conrad, some of those cargo descriptions, the originals before the template change, listed precursor chemicals, the kind that require specific federal permits to transport. The kind where filing the wrong manifest isn't just freight fraud. You're potentially moving controlled substance precursors across state lines without the authorization to do it. The room shrank. The walls of room 412 pulled inward from every direction while I lay at the center with the phone to my ear and the slow, sickening understanding of how large this had actually grown. "How long has she been running the falsified manifests?" I asked. 6 weeks, roughly 40 shipments. A pause. "She kept copies of everything, Conrad. The original manifests, the revised ones, the emails from Renata laying out the template instructions. She photographed them on her personal phone because she didn't know what else to do. She was afraid to raise it, internally didn't know who she could trust. Afraid to take it outside the company because she didn't know what it would mean for her job, or whether anyone would take her word over Renata Caldwell's. Cecily has been with us 3 years. I said she has done nothing wrong. I know, he said. And once I told her that once I made clear her immigration status had no bearing on any of this, Lionel stopped. I heard him press his lips together, the sound a man makes when he is working very hard not to let something through. She started crying. Conrad, right there in the coffee shop. Said she'd been carrying this alone for 6 weeks. Didn't tell anyone because she didn't believe anyone would choose her account over Renata Caldwell's. Something moved through my chest. Not grief exactly, not fury exactly, but something that lived in the gap between those two things. Hot and tight and too big to hold cleanly. Cecily Dunbar had been sitting in her office at the City of Industry Yard for 6 weeks, running falsified paperwork on shipments. She didn't fully understand, carrying a fear she couldn't put down and couldn't share, because she worked for a company with my name stenciled on the side of every truck. And she did not believe that anyone with the power to act would bother listening to her. That was my failure as much as anyone else's. I felt it the way you feel a truth that's been waiting for you suddenly, completely, with no room left to argue around it. Tell me about the evidence she has, I said. Video, Lionel said. She started recording on her phone roughly 2 weeks back, once she understood the manifests weren't any kind of compliance update. She recorded herself working through the filing process. You can see the original cargo descriptions, the template changes, the final versions that went into the system. She also has screenshots of the email chain from Renata. He paused. She did it in the storage room at the back of the logistics office. No cameras back there. I told her to keep going. Good. I pressed my palm flat against the mattress. Lionel, I need something from you. Anything. Tell Cecily she is not alone in this. Tell her that what she did, holding on to those records coming to you, took more courage than most people can manage. And tell her I stopped, drew a breath that caught against my ribs. Tell her that the name on the side of those trucks is supposed to stand for something, and I mean to see that it still does. Lionel was quiet for a moment. When he came back, the careful flatness had gone out of his voice. It was rougher now, the way a man sounds when he is keeping something in that does not want to stay in. She asked me something he said after I told her we were going to handle this. She asked why you built the company the way you did, the compliance systems, the record-keeping, all the ELD tracking. Said it always seemed like a lot of extra effort for a freight operation. What did you tell her? I told her you built it that way, because you believed that an honest operation has nothing to hide in its paperwork. A pause. She said that made sense. Then she said she was glad she'd come to me. I closed my eyes. Beyond the window, the Los Angeles morning was doing what it does, burning the marine layer off in stages, the sky moving from gray through a pale, washed-out blue that would settle into something almost beautiful by midday. I was going to get out of this hospital. I was going to walk back through the doors of that building with my name on it. And when I did, every person who had trusted Caldwell Freight, every driver, every coordinator, every warehouse worker who had shown up and done honest work was going to know that the trust hadn't been thrown away. Lionel, my voice came out steadier than I had any right to expect. Tell Cecily to keep recording. Document everything. And Lionel, I stopped. How are you holding up? He let out a breath that was almost a laugh. Been better. Also been considerably worse. A pause. You remember 2009 when Carol was sick, and I couldn't see how we were going to get through it. You told me the company would take care of it. Don't worry about the money. His voice tightened a fraction. You never once asked me to pay it back, Conrad. Not in 15 years. You didn't need to pay it back. No, he said quietly. But I needed someone to believe I was worth the risk. A long pause. I'm holding up fine. I'll talk to Cecily this afternoon. After the call, I set the phone on the nightstand and looked at the drawer where my phone had been sitting. The night Officer Fairfax came through the room. I thought about everything that had been set moving since then. Fletcher with his records, Lionel with his timestamps, Cecily with a phone full of evidence she had gathered by herself in a storage room because she believed it was the right thing to do. My phone buzzed once. A text from Lionel. Renata just called a staff meeting for tomorrow morning. She's asking Cecily to present the new manifest process to the full logistics team. My jaw tightened until I felt it in my back teeth. She was going to make Cecily stand in front of her colleagues and walk them through a falsified system, make her complicit in front of witnesses, make it that much harder to step back from. I typed 4 words, tell Cecily to go, then added 3 more and keep recording. The staff meeting ran 45 minutes. Lionel called me the moment he reached his office, and I could hear in his voice the particular strain of a man who has just sat in a room watching something unfold that he couldn't stop and wasn't supposed to stop. She did what you asked, he said, stood up there and walked the full logistics team through the new manifest process, all 18 people in the room. She kept her voice level, never looked at Renata once. A pause. I don't know how she held it together, Conrad. I genuinely don't. She held it together because she had to. I said what happened after Renata thanked her. Warmly, publicly. Lionel's voice carried something underneath the words, a kind of restrained disgust he was working to keep buried. And then, at the close of the meeting, Renata mentioned, almost in passing, the way you mentioned something you've been sitting on for a while, that she'd noticed some irregularities in the accounts payable records from the past quarter. Said she wanted the financial team to run a full internal review. He stopped. She was looking straight at me when she said it. Conrad, I pressed my palm into the mattress. She's setting you up. That's what it felt like, he said. His voice was level, but the effort behind it was audible. The effort of someone who has kept his composure in hard rooms for 22 years and is drawing on every one of those years right now. I stayed after everyone cleared out and asked her directly if there was something specific I should be aware of. She smiled and said she just wanted to make sure everything was in order. Said it the way people say things when they mean the precise opposite. I kept my voice low and even. Do not go back into that building tonight. Go home. Don't touch the systems and don't respond to any requests for financial records until I say so. Already my plan, he said. A brief pause. What I was about to learn would shift everything I thought I understood about who was protecting me and who was watching me fall. Before we get there, if you suspected someone close to you was quietly working against you, would you move in silence and gather your proof, or would you confront them the moment you knew, But Conrad, one more thing. On my way out to the car after everyone cleared the room, there was a man sitting in a dark sedan in the parking lot. Never got out. He was already there when I pulled in and hadn't moved by the time I left. LAPD plates. Fairfax had eyes on Lionel, running surveillance, the same way he did everything else quietly without drawing attention, with the patient thoroughness of someone who understood that the best watch is the one nobody ever clocks. "How much runway do you think you have before she acts?" I asked. "A week at the outside, probably less, before she puts something formal in front of the board." He let out a slow breath. "Conrad, I've got all of it. 3 months' worth records, emails, transaction logs, the routing authorizations that existed before they were overwritten, the payment schedules tied to the shell accounts, every piece I've been pulling together since July. The moment she moves on me and cuts off my access, it's gone. Get it to Fletcher before that happens," I said. "Today. Don't wait for morning. That was already my plan." A pause. When he spoke again, something in the register had changed, quieter, less businesslike, the kind of shift that means a man is about to say something he's been holding for a while. Something in it reminded me of a phone call from a hospital parking lot a long time ago, 15 years back. "Conrad, regardless of how the next few days shake out, there's something I need to say." "Lionel," I said. "Go ahead." He steadied himself. "In 2009, you handed me $40,000 and never asked what it was, for never set terms. You just said, 'Take care of Carol. Don't give the company a second thought. It'll be here when you come back.'" His voice went tighter. "It was still there because of you. I've carried that for 15 years, tried every day to be someone who deserved it." A long pause. "I'm going to get this right. You have my word on that." Something tightened in my throat. I had to look out the window at the pale midday sky above City of Industry, press my lips together, and wait for it to pass. "I know you will," I said. "Now go. Drive safe." Fletcher phoned at 4 in the afternoon, 2 hours after Lionel had reached his house in Visalia, carrying a portable drive with everything he'd been documenting since July. "The timestamps hold up," Fletcher told me, and underneath the words I heard the measured satisfaction of someone whose careful work had just been vindicated. Every transaction Lionel put his name to, not one exception, carries an approval stamp predating the moment those entries were touched. In certain cases, the window between the two is just 4 hours. Others, it runs to several days. He paused. "The person who altered those records worked carefully, but they missed one thing: the original authorization logs live on a separate server, and that server only syncs once every 72 hours. The changes are visible in the main system. The approvals are visible in the backup. Put them side by side, and they tell two different stories." "Meaning Lionel's authorizations were legitimate," I said, "and the figures were doctored afterward by someone else." "That's exactly right. Lionel Haig is clean, more than clean. 3 months of deliberate record-keeping on his part is the only reason we can run that comparison at all." Fletcher's voice stayed even and precise, shaped by years of writing reports that had to stand up in federal proceedings. "Conrad, stack what Lionel brought me on top of Cecily's manifests and the ELD data, and we are no longer working with a thread. We've got a rope." I let that sit a moment. A rope, something with actual tensile strength. Something that in the right hands could bring the whole thing down. "What does our window look like?" I asked. "Give me 48 hours to package the documents into a form that means something to a federal agent." "But before we get there," he paused. "Conrad, there's a piece of this you need to hear before we go anywhere near the FBI." "Tell me." I traced the money moving through the shell accounts Lionel flagged. "It doesn't go to Sterling Novak directly. There are three intermediate entities between the falsified shipments and Novak Capital Group. One of them is a charitable organization registered right here in California. He stopped. It goes by the name California Senior Assistance Fund. The person listed as director is Deputy Chief Philip Merritt of the Los Angeles Police Department. The name struck me the way a hard object strikes a dull, immediate pressure behind the breastbone that had nothing to do with my ribs. A deputy chief with his fingerprints on the money, with a line running straight to Fairfax, to the shell companies, to the trucks that had been carrying chemicals across state lines under false manifests. Fairfax Works Commercial Transport Division, I said. Merritt is his immediate superior, Fletcher confirmed. So when Sterling Novak needed someone inside law enforcement to keep a lid on this operation, he didn't go looking for a badge on the street. He went several ranks up, someone positioned high enough that problems could be erased before they ever surfaced. I closed my eyes, pressed the back of my hand to my mouth, and held it there for a moment. The full shape of what had been constructed, the patience behind it, the layers, the number of people who had been bought or placed or quietly turned, it came down on me all at once. The weight of something that had been built over years and designed to last. Every piece of it sat on my company's foundation. My name on the trucks, my roots, my 3.5 decades of running clean, all of it had been the camouflage. A freight company with an unblemished record draws no scrutiny. I had spent 35 years making Caldwell Freight invisible to investigators, and someone had understood exactly what that was worth. My phone buzzed before I could say anything. I pulled it back from my ear. A notification from the hospital's patient portal, a new document added to my file by the medical records department. I pulled it open, expecting a lab result or a discharge form. It was neither of those things. It was a legal notice, and the header told me everything before I'd read a word of it. Superior Court of California County of Los Angeles Probate Division. Below that, in the same dry, formal language I had been reading on contracts and filings for 3 decades. Petition for appointment of conservator of the estate of Conrad James Caldwell. The petitioner was Renata Christine Caldwell. I raised the phone back to my ear. Fletcher, I said. She filed. A brief silence, clipped and controlled. The conservatorship. Yes. When did it go in? I checked the timestamp. The court had it this morning. I'm reading the notice right now. I scrolled into the attachments. A medical assessment from Dr. Hollis at Huntington Hospital, written in the weeks after the accident, evaluating my cognitive function following the head injury. The language was careful and exact. It described a patient whose capacity for sound judgment and independent decision-making had been materially affected by the trauma. Dr. Hollis, methodical, thorough, the doctor who had put the same battery of cognitive questions to me 3 separate times across 2 weeks. His notes had been used to build something he never intended to build. Someone got to him, I said. Novak or Renata. Fletcher's voice came back flat. Conrad, this compresses everything. Filing the petition alone doesn't hand her the keys. The court assigns an investigator and calendars a full hearing before anything transfers. But alongside the petition, she has submitted an emergency motion for temporary conservatorship. A judge can approve that within 72 hours on the strength of the medical filing alone, without convening a hearing. If that temporary order lands before we've put any counter-evidence on the table, she walks away with provisional control of your estate. Your 75% stake in Caldwell Freight included while the main proceeding works its way through the calendar. And reversing a conservatorship order even once the fraud is out in the open is measured in months. I stared at the screen, my name at the top of the filing, the word petitioner attached to my daughter's. My grip on the phone tightened until I felt it across my knuckles. We accelerate, I said. Who handles conservatorship defense? someone who does it full-time, Fletcher said. Elder law, corporate fraud background, Los Angeles County. Give me an hour and I'll have a name. I put the phone on the nightstand and stared up at the ceiling of room 412. A cart moved past in the hallway. A laugh drifted over from the nurse's station. Ordinary sounds from an ordinary afternoon, while something far from ordinary was unfolding in room 412, around a man who had not seemed worth watching. I picked the phone back up and began reading. In 35 years of running a freight company, I had worked through stacks of legal paper partnership agreements, carrier contracts, insurance riders, regulatory submissions, yard leases across 5 states. The lesson I had taken from all of it was simple: the sentence that costs you is never the one up front in bold. It is always the one that sits quietly on page 7 in the same typeface as everything surrounding it, written so that the eye slides over it without stopping. The conservatorship petition ran 42 pages. I read it twice through. In the thin afternoon light of room 412, with the monitors humming and the hall sounds leaking under the door, I went through every paragraph of the document my daughter had filed with the Los Angeles Superior Court Probate Division under California Probate Code, Section 1801. The legal standard for conservatorship of an estate is a person who is substantially unable to manage his or her own financial resources, or to resist fraud or undue influence. Renata's petition argued I met that bar, that the head trauma from the accident, the one her shell company had engineered, had left my cognition compromised to the point where independent control of my assets posed a danger to my own interests. The whole thing rested on a medical foundation, a detailed assessment written by Dr. Burton Hollis of Huntington Hospital. My attending physician describing a patient who showed confusion, impaired short-term memory, difficulty handling complex information, and diminished capacity for sound financial judgment. I set the petition down on my lap and looked out the window for a moment. During our second week together, Dr. Hollis had asked me to walk him through the route from the City of Industry Yard to the Port of Los Angeles. I described it without hesitation, including the construction detour on the 710 that had been running since August. He'd asked me to hold 3 words in mind table pencil: September, then come back to them 15 minutes later after we'd been talking about something else. I recalled them without trouble. He asked whether I had confidence in the people running the company while I was off my feet. I told him yes. I had been performing the part of a man who trusted his daughter. I had performed it convincingly. What I understood now was that Dr. Hollis had been performing a part as well. His assessment described someone who had stumbled through those memory exercises, someone who had expressed uncertainty about the company's operations, someone who had shown in his words an inability to critically evaluate information presented by family members in positions of authority. Not one word of it was true. Every line was a fabrication produced by a physician who had spent 6 weeks treating me and had either taken money to lie or had been maneuvered into a position where lying felt like the safer path. My jaw went tight. I breathed through it, counted to 10, the way Vivian had shown me when I was 32, and ready to blow up a contract negotiation that I eventually won by holding steady when the other side assumed I'd crack. Then I dialed the number Fletcher had sent me. Ingrid Pelham picked up on the second ring. Her voice was direct, without an edge to it, the voice of someone who had figured out long ago that the most reliable way to project authority is simply to mean what you say. "Mr. Caldwell," she said. "Fletcher Grady reached me about an hour ago. I've been waiting for your call. Then you have the shape of it. I have an outline. Fill in the rest." I did. The petition, the medical assessment, Dr. Hollis's role in it, the accident timeline, the shell company, Sterling Novak, the falsified freight manifests the conservatorship as the lever Renata needed, because a shareholder vote couldn't remove me. I didn't rush. Ingrid Pelham was not someone you rushed, not out of deference, but because speed would cost you precision, and precision was the only thing that counted in this conversation. When I finished, she was silent for exactly 4 seconds. I counted them. "All right," she said. "Two things running at the same time. First, under California Probate Code, Section 1826, I am requesting an independent medical examination, today, a court-appointed physician with no connection to Huntington Hospital. Second, and more pressing, Renata has included an emergency motion for temporary conservatorship in this filing. That is where the real exposure is. A temporary order can be issued ex parte without you in the room if a judge finds the medical documentation persuasive. I am filing an immediate opposition to that motion. My argument is that a man who ran a 230-vehicle freight operation for 35 years does not require emergency financial protection on the basis of a 6-week assessment authored by a physician who collected $80,000 from the opposing party's primary financial backer. The emergency motion won't hold once I put that in front of a judge. What does that buy us? 4 to 6 weeks, depending on the court's schedule, enough to build a proper defense. And if the criminal evidence is as substantial as you're describing, enough time for the FBI to enter the picture in a way that shifts the entire legal terrain." A pause. "The physician who produced the assessment backing this petition, Dr. Hollis. Do you have reason to believe he was paid to write it?" I thought about the way Fletcher had traced the money, the shell accounts, the intermediate entities stacked on top of each other, the California Senior Assistance Fund, with Philip Merritt's name attached to it. "I believe he was," I said. "I don't have direct proof in hand yet, but the person financing this operation has deep resources and a clear track record of purchasing cooperation. Under California Penal Code Section 67, compensating a professional to produce false testimony or documentation is criminal bribery," Ingrid said. Section 2234 of the Business and Professions Code covers physicians specifically generating a false medical report for financial gain is grounds for criminal prosecution and permanent revocation of licensure. There was a precision in her voice, the satisfaction of someone selecting exactly the right instrument for the work. "If we can show Dr. Hollis received payment, the medical underpinning of this petition falls apart. And without that foundation, there is no petition. How do we prove the payment? That's work for your investigator and ultimately for the Bureau. My job is to stop the court from acting on this petition before the facts have time to catch up." Another pause. "Mr. Caldwell, I want to ask you something directly." "Go ahead." "The petitioner is your daughter. If this proceeds to a full evidentiary hearing, if we place the medical documentation, the financial records, and the criminal conduct on the table in front of a judge, there is no way to disentangle her role from the broader conspiracy. Her exposure will be complete and public." Ingrid's voice stayed level and measured. "I need to understand whether that changes your position." I looked at the window of room 412 at the afternoon light, which had gone the particular gold that settles over Los Angeles in November when the Santa Anas have cleared the marine layer back toward the ocean. I thought about Renata at 11 folding a napkin at the kitchen table in her black dress. About her at 16 bringing that rig around the yard in a clean arc. About her face in this room 2 weeks ago, warm and unhurried, and making me laugh, telling me not to let them talk me into the meatloaf. And about the fact that the woman who had said that was the same woman whose name sat at the top of a 42-page legal filing, built to strip away everything I had spent my life constructing. It doesn't change anything I said. What she did carries consequences. That's not something I have the power to absorb for her. A pause. Understood. Ingrid Pelham's voice shifted, not softer exactly, but more human in a way it hadn't been a moment before. "I will submit the Section 1826 request within the hour. I'll also seek a full copy of Dr. Hollis's financial records from the court as part of our discovery. If there's a payment, we'll find it." "Thank you," I said. Don't thank me yet. Thank me when it's over. A brief pause. One more thing, Mr. Caldwell. Until this matter is resolved, you do not sign anything. Not a medical release, not a hospital form, not a get-well card. Nothing with your signature goes out without my review. Are we clear completely? Good. And underneath the professionalism, I heard something that might have been respect. Get some rest. You'll need to be sharp for what's coming. After the call, I set the phone on the nightstand and released a breath that had been lodged in my chest for the better part of an hour. My ribs ached. My skull throbbed at the base. The November light was painting the window in shades of orange and gold. And somewhere in this building, Sterling Novak had bought the cooperation of a physician named Hollis, who was at this moment making his afternoon rounds, unaware that the petition he had put his signature to had just become the loose thread from which everything else would unravel. I reached over and opened the nightstand drawer. Inside, beside my reading glasses and the phone charger, was the business card Wade Fairfax had left on my tray table 6 weeks ago. I picked it up, turned it over once, then dropped it into the trash can beside the bed. I had better people working on this now. Ingrid Pelham submitted the Section 1826 request at 4:47 that afternoon. I know the precise time because she sent a confirmation message with the court filing timestamp attached, followed by a single line, "Motion filed." The clock is running in our favor now. I read it twice. Then I set the phone down and felt for the first time in 6 weeks something that was not quite hope, but was close enough that I recognized it for what it was. It did not last long. Hope rarely does when you've seen the full shape of what you're up against. Fletcher called the following morning with the financial trace results. $80,000, he said without preamble. Transferred in 2 installments, $40,000 in late August, $40,000 in early September, out of a holding account tied to one of Novak Capital Group's subsidiary entities, and into a personal account belonging to Dr. Burton Hollis. A pause. The first transfer landed 3 weeks before your accident, Conrad. The second came 4 days after you were admitted to Huntington Hospital. I sat with that. Turned it over slowly. He was paid before the accident. That meant the medical assessment wasn't improvised. It was designed in advance. Someone had decided before you ever ended up in that hospital bed that they were going to need a doctor willing to say whatever they required him to say. Fletcher's voice was flat and without inflection. Sterling Novak did not respond to your accident, Conrad. He arranged it and then built the medical paperwork around it while you were still on the operating table. My grip tightened on the phone. Through the window, the November sky stretched out in the dull, featureless gray of a city that had forgotten what rain felt like. I pressed my back into the pillow and breathed through the pressure in my chest until it eased enough to bear. The payment goes to Ingrid, I said. Today sending it now, then a pause. There's something else. Under California Penal Code Section 67, compensating a private individual, including a physician, to generate false documentation constitutes criminal bribery. Section 2234 addresses professional misconduct specifically, but Conrad Fletcher chose his words with deliberate care. Fairfax is a different matter. He is a sworn officer of the law, a public official. Payments made to a public official in exchange for official acts fall under Federal Statute 18 United States Code, Section 201. That is a federal bribery charge. Minimum 2 years, maximum 15. Had the money been traced all the way across. 3 payments, total of $62,000 over 18 months, routed through the same layered account structure Novak had used for Hollis. A pause. Fairfax had been on Novak's payroll since before the fraud was ever set in motion. He wasn't brought in after the fact. He was woven into the original design. I thought about Fairfax sitting in the chair beside my hospital bed that first night, warning me about Renata, while his eyes tracked around the room searching for the USB drive. He had pocketed $62,000 to make sure the whole operation moved without friction. Walking into my hospital room had been a business decision, nothing more, nothing less. "Does Fairfax know we have the financial records?" I asked. "Not yet, but Novak does." Fletcher's voice went tight. "I have a contact at a commercial real estate firm in Laguna Beach, someone who worked alongside Novak Capital Group 3 years ago, and has kept eyes on the company since. She reached out this morning. There was an emergency meeting at Novak's office yesterday afternoon. After it wrapped, 2 of his senior associates were on a flight to New York. The pattern looks like asset movement. Sterling had found out through his connections in the court system, through someone inside Ingrid Pelham's office, through a contact in the probate division, that the conservatorship petition was being challenged, and he had started moving. "How much time do we have?" I asked. "Less than we did yesterday," Fletcher said, "which is why I need you to let me contact the FBI today. Not tomorrow. Today." I thought back to what Fletcher had said 2 weeks earlier. "Once we bring this to the FBI, we lose control of what comes next." I had wanted to wait until I had a complete picture. I had a complete picture now. It was bigger than I'd imagined and more calculated than I had feared, and waiting any longer wasn't caution anymore. It was a luxury I could no longer carry. "Make the call," I said. What happened next reached me the way most things reached me during those weeks in room 412 secondhand, through phone calls and text messages, and the careful reassembly of events I hadn't witnessed myself. What I know is, this Sterling Novak received confirmation that Ingrid Pelham had filed the independent medical examination request at approximately 5:00 on a Tuesday afternoon. By 6:00, he had placed a call to Wade Fairfax. I know what passed between them on that call, because Fairfax described it to the FBI 6 days later in a conference room on the 11th floor of the federal building, 11,000 Wilshire Boulevard. He laid it out in the flat, measured language of a man who has concluded that accuracy is his only remaining asset. Sterling had said 4 words. Clean it up. Wade Fairfax knew exactly what those 4 words meant. He had spent 19 years in law enforcement, 6 of them in the commercial transport division. He knew what it looked like when a principal decided to cut a connection loose. And he understood what being cut loose looked like from the other side of that decision. He told the FBI that he sat in his car in the parking structure beneath the Novak Capital Group building in Laguna Beach for 22 minutes after that call ended. He sat there and thought about the $62,000 that had moved through the intermediate account over the past 18 months. He thought about the camera footage he had deleted from the Florence and Eastern intersection on the morning of Conrad Caldwell's accident. He thought about the hospital room he had entered through a locked door on a Tuesday night in September. He thought through all of it. And then he thought about what happens to a man who knows too much and has outlived his usefulness. Fairfax had spent 19 years watching other people calculate the distance between loyalty and survival. He had always told himself that when his own moment came, he would handle it differently, that some version of honor would factor into it. Sitting in that parking structure with Sterling Novak's 4 words still echoing in his ears, he understood he had been wrong about that. There was no honor in any of this. There was only arithmetic. He called his personal attorney from the car. Then he drove home, made himself a cup of coffee, and sat at his kitchen table until 8:00 in the morning. Then he drove to the Federal Building, 11,000 Wilshire Boulevard, and asked to speak with someone from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. He did not call Novak back. He did not warn Renata. He did not send word to Deputy Chief Merritt. He simply drove to Wilshire Boulevard, and walked through the front door because that was the only move left on the board that didn't end with him in a cell. I knew none of this when it was happening. I was lying in room 412 staring at the ceiling thinking about my daughter and a doctor who had sold his professional integrity for $80,000 and a man named Sterling who had been patient enough to wait 6 years for the right opening. My phone buzzed. A text from Fletcher. 3 words: FBI made contact. I set the phone down on the mattress and pressed both palms flat against the blanket, feeling the dull ache in my ribs that had become over the past 2 months as constant and familiar as my own heartbeat. Then out in the hallway I caught the particular sound of footsteps halting outside room 412, not the rolling shuffle of a nurse doing rounds, not the purposeful stride of Dr. Hollis. Slower, more deliberate. They paused outside my door for 3 full seconds. Then they moved on. I lay completely still and listened until they faded down the corridor. Whoever it was, they had stopped. They had looked. And they had decided for now to keep walking. I thought about Cecily Dunbar alone in a storage room with a phone in her hand, recording things she was terrified to learn. I thought about Lionel driving through the night to Visalia with a portable drive carrying 3 months of evidence. I thought about Fletcher cross-referencing financial records in a house in the Visalia Hills with the same precision he had brought to every inspection report he had ever written. They were all out there doing what had to be done. And tomorrow, a 29-year-old woman named Cecily Dunbar was going to walk into a building on Wilshire Boulevard and do something that demanded more courage than anything I had managed from this hospital bed. I owed every one of them better than room 412. I picked up my phone and called Dr. Hollis's office line. When his assistant answered, I asked to schedule a discharge evaluation for the following week. It was time to start getting out of this bed. Fairfax did not walk into the FBI Los Angeles field office unannounced. Those 22 minutes in the parking structure had settled something in him. From the car, Fairfax had dialed his personal attorney. The attorney made 2 calls of his own, one to a former federal prosecutor he had a history with, and one to the duty agent at the FBI's Los Angeles field office. A meeting was locked in before the sun came up. Fairfax pushed through the entrance of the federal building 11,000 Wilshire Boulevard at 7:53 that morning. He knew the names of the agent he was walking toward. He knew what he was going to say when he got there. The decision had been made in that parking garage, and it showed in his face a particular blankness that comes from a night spent crossing a line you cannot step back over. His hands resting on the reception counter were almost unnervingly still. A duty agent rode with him straight to the 11th floor. The agent at the desk took one look at him and reached for the phone without a word. 15 minutes after that, Fairfax was seated across a conference table from Special Agent Zora Asante. She ran younger than he'd pictured, early 40s, and carried the kind of composed, unhurried quiet that experienced interrogators cultivate deliberately. A legal pad went down in front of her. She uncapped a pen. She looked at him and gave him nothing to read. "You came in voluntarily," she said. "That matters. Tell me why you're here." Fairfax leaned in, planted both palms flat on the table, and after one hard clench of his jaw, he began. 2 hours. That's how long he talked. He laid out Sterling Novak's first approach 3 years back, an intermediary, a department function somewhere in downtown Los Angeles. He accounted for every $62,000 spread across 18 months funneled through a real estate holding company in Hawthorne, specifically to keep it from being traced directly. He walked her through his piece of the operation, keeping watch on Caldwell Freight Solutions vehicles, steering LAPD commercial transport citations, clear of the trucks moving the falsified manifests, and erasing the camera footage from the Florence and Eastern intersection on the morning of Conrad Caldwell's accident. Zora Asante's pen never stopped. She didn't cut him off once. Her expression remained a closed door throughout. Every so often she'd drop in a single sharp question that made it obvious she was several steps ahead of whatever he was disclosing. When the 2 hours were done, she set her pen down and held his gaze. "When you wiped that camera footage," she said, "did you know Conrad Caldwell was going to be seriously hurt?" Fairfax didn't look away. Something moved through his jaw, small, involuntary, reined in before it could surface fully. Then his eyes dropped to the table. "I knew a vehicle incident had been arranged," he said. "I didn't know how bad it would be, but you erased the footage regardless." "Yes." Zora picked her pen back up. "And on the night of September 19th, when you let yourself into Mr. Caldwell's hospital room by that point, did you know he was innocent?" The silence in the room had weight to it. Fairfax could make out the low hum of the ventilation above the drop ceiling. Faintly, 11 floors down the city went about its business. "Yes," he said. "I knew." Zora made a note. Then she looked up. "I'm stepping out for 10 minutes. When I return, we're going to have a conversation about what cooperation actually means, what it requires, and what it doesn't cover. I'd like you to sit with that distinction while I'm out." She capped her pen, got to her feet, and left without a backward glance. The conference room went quiet around Fairfax. He pressed his hands flat against the table surface and studied them, the hands of someone who had put 19 years into law enforcement and spent the last 18 months running that reputation as camouflage for something he couldn't square with himself anymore. When Novak had first made his pitch, Fairfax had constructed a story, short-term contained, nobody gets seriously hurt, walk away clean at the end. He had built that story carefully and lived inside it for 18 months. Most of it, it turned out, had been scaffolding he needed, rather than anything solid. Zora Asante was back in exactly 10 minutes. Fresh page on the legal pad. Same expression. "Here is what cooperation looks like," she said. "Complete disclosure. Nothing withheld, nothing softened, nobody shielded. Every name, every payment, every order you were given, and every action you carried out. Your attorney and the federal prosecutor will then discuss the terms of a proffer agreement. That is not a promise of any outcome. It is a door." "I understand," Fairfax said. "Good." She lifted her pen. "Then we'll begin with Deputy Chief Philip Merritt. That afternoon I was flat on my back in room 412 when Fletcher's second text came through. 2 words. He's talking. I read it and put the phone on the nightstand. Stared at the ceiling. Something moved in my chest that I couldn't name cleanly, not relief exactly, not grief exactly. Somewhere between the two. The feeling of watching a thing that has resisted every push finally give way. What I had no way of knowing was that at that precise moment out on the sidewalk in front of the federal building, 11,000 Wilshire Boulevard, a 29-year-old woman named Cecily Dunbar was standing in the raw November air, her face tipped up toward the building's glass face. She had her phone in her bag. On it, 3 months of evidence. She had been rooted to that spot for 14 minutes. She was afraid in the way that makes your legs heavy. She was still there. Cecily Dunbar came through the front doors of the federal building, 11,000 Wilshire Boulevard, at 8:21 that morning. She had come close to leaving twice. The first time she had actually reversed 4 full steps, back in the direction of the parking structure, before something made her stop. The second time she'd pulled out her phone and gotten halfway through a message to Lionel saying she couldn't go through with it. Then she read what she'd written, and she thought about her father, who had hauled freight across California for 22 years and never once suggested the roads were too hard. She deleted the message. She walked through the door. The woman at the front desk pointed her toward the 3rd floor. Another agent walked her down a hallway to a room. Cecily took a plastic chair outside the door, set her bag across her knees, and worked on breathing. When Zora Asante stepped out and said her name, Cecily got up so fast, the bag nearly went with her. "It's all right," Zora said. "Take your time." Inside the room, Cecily sat across the table from her. The bag stayed in her lap. She reached in and brought out her phone and placed it on the table between them. "Everything is on here," she said. The steadiness in her own voice surprised her. Videos, emails, the manifests as they existed before anyone touched them, and the versions that replaced them. 47 shipments in total. I organized and dated everything the way Lionel had walked me through. Zora glanced at the phone but left it where it was. She looked at Cecily instead. "Before we go through any of this," she said, "there are things I need you to hear first. You walked in here on your own. Nothing you say in this room today can be turned against you without your full knowledge and agreement. You are entitled to have legal counsel present." A pause. "Is there someone you'd like to reach before we go further?" Cecily shook her head. "I just want this to be over." Zora gave a single nod and picked up the phone. The first video played. She watched without a word. On screen, Cecily's hands moved across a desk in a room that looked like a storage space, bare concrete walls, metal shelving, a fluorescent tube overhead. She was working through 2 sets of manifest documents at once, lifting them toward the camera, in turn reading out the cargo descriptions. The originals had the regulated chemical compounds named correctly, proper classification codes beside each one. The altered versions reduced everything to general freight equipment components, nothing specific. Cecily's voice on the recording trembled slightly at the edges, but not a single word was lost. Zora watched 3 more videos after that. Then she set the phone down. "How long had you been sitting on this before you said anything to anyone?" 6 weeks. Cecily's jaw went tight. "I know that's too long. I kept convincing myself I was reading it wrong, that there was some context I was missing." Her lips pressed together. "There wasn't. You brought it to Lionel Haig. He was the one person in that building I felt I could trust." Cecily's eyes dropped to her own hands resting on the table. Her fingers were wound together, the knuckles drained of color. "He told me about Mr. Caldwell, what had been done to him, and what was still being done. He told me Mr. Caldwell had run the company the way he did because he believed that clean paperwork left nothing to fear." Her voice snagged on something. "My father drove trucks for 22 years. He hauled for outfits that didn't much care whether he came home at the end of a run. He had a saying, the only thing a driver truly owns is his record, his hours, his logbook, his delivery history. Keep those clean and nobody can touch him." She lifted her eyes to Zora. "I was making those records dirty. I was doing it inside a company built by a man who held the same belief my father did. I couldn't keep going." Zora said nothing for a moment. Then, "You're going to be okay, Miss Dunbar." Cecily gave a small nod. Her eyes had gone bright and wet at the corners, but she didn't let anything spill. She had kept it together for 6 weeks. A little longer wasn't going to break her. "One more thing," Zora said. "Does anyone at Caldwell Freight Solutions know you were walking in here today?" "To Lionel. Nobody else." "And you haven't been in touch with anyone else who might be connected to this?" Cecily shook her head. She didn't know who else was connected. She had no idea about Fairfax. She didn't know about Fletcher Grady or Ingrid Pelham or the conservatorship petition sitting in probate court, or the 4 words Sterling Novak had spoken to a man in a parking garage in Laguna Beach. She knew what she had witnessed in a storage room with bare concrete walls and fluorescent light overhead, and she had carried every bit of it in here and put it on the table. Zora stood. "I'll be back in a few minutes. There's coffee out in the hallway if you need it." After she left, Cecily sat alone. She unclenched her fingers and turned her hands over palms flat against the table, felt the solid surface hold her, and breathed. Her phone was still there in front of her. Zora hadn't taken it. The videos were still on it. All of them. Everyone she had captured on that phone inside the storage room over 6 weeks of lunch breaks and late hours, and once at 6:00 in the morning, before a single other person had come through the door. 47 manifests. 47 moments when she had looked at what she was being asked to falsify and understood that it was wrong. Every one of those moments had frightened her. She was still frightened now. But she was here. Through the wall came the muffled shape of Zora Asante's voice, controlled precise, someone issuing instructions. Then words distinct enough to catch. Pull every EL record from Caldwell freight vehicles, all of them September through December, and get the DEA on the line. Cecily didn't know what EL stood for. She didn't know what the DEA's involvement meant in this context. What she knew was that something on the other side of that wall had changed register, and that whatever she had walked through the front door carrying that morning was heavier than she had realized. She picked up her phone from the table, unlocked it, and opened her messages. She typed 3 words to Lionel, "I did it." Then she pushed back in the plastic chair and waited. Fletcher called on a Tuesday afternoon in late November. I'd been up since 5:00 in the morning. Not from pain, which had settled into something I could manage over the past weeks, but from the specific restlessness of a man who senses the end of something approaching and can't stop his mind from running ahead of it. 23, Fletcher said. Just the number, nothing attached to it. He knew I'd follow. Tell me, I said. 23 routes across 4 months, September through December. Every one of them showed stop locations that don't appear anywhere in a Caldwell Freight Solutions client contract. He laid it out the way he always did. Methodical, no flourish, the unhurried cadence of someone who had spent 20 years drafting federal inspection reports. The electronic logging device data doesn't lie. Conrad under 49 CFR Part 395, every commercial vehicle in your fleet is required to record its position continuously. That data can't be overridden by hand. Whatever those trucks did, the devices have it on record. Where were the stops? A warehouse facility out in Paris, roughly 60 miles east of your City of Industry yard, and a cold storage unit in Jamaica, Queens, in the freight corridor near the rail lines. A pause. DEA confirmed the nature of the materials late yesterday afternoon. Precursor chemicals, compounds used in the manufacture of controlled substances regulated under 21 United States Code, Sections 841 and 846. Moving those materials across state lines without the proper federal authorization is a serious felony. I pressed my palm flat against the mattress. Outside, the November afternoon was doing what it always does in Los Angeles, pulling the light slow and golden, making the whole city look softer than it is. The drivers, I said. My drivers. Clean, Fletcher said, and his voice didn't waver. Every last one. They drove the dispatched routes. The stop locations were entered into the system after the routes were assigned. As far as those drivers knew, those stops were authorized client addresses. Their paperwork said so. They had no cause to question it. A pause. Conrad, your people did nothing wrong. I closed my eyes. Let that land the way good news lands when you've been bracing for the worst carefully, like something you're afraid to grip too hard in case it isn't real. 340 employees. Every one of them had shown up, done the job, and trusted that the company they were working for stood for what it claimed to stand for. That trust had been warranted. The rot hadn't reached them. It had moved around them through the management layer above them, through channels they had no sight line into. What does Zora need from me? I asked. The shareholders' meeting, Fletcher said. Renata filed notice this morning. Emergency session Caldwell Freight Solutions conference room, Wednesday of next week, 10:00. A pause with weight behind it. She's trying to get the conservatorship formalized before the independent medical examination can be completed. She needs the board on record endorsing the petition. The strategy was plain to me the moment he said it. If Renata could bring the board to a formal vote supporting the conservatorship before Ingrid's independent examiner filed a counter-assessment, it would create a public record that would take months to dismantle even once the fraud was fully exposed. Zora wants to use it, I said. She wants to make the arrests at the meeting. Renata and Sterling together, before either one of them understands, the walls are already moving inward. Fletcher's voice was even and measured. Sterling will be there. He needs to be seen backing the transfer of control. It is the final piece of the show. I thought about the second-floor conference room, the long table where I'd sat for 30 years, the window overlooking the yard where the trucks lined up before daylight every morning. How much time do I have? I asked. 8 days. 8 days. After 3 months in a hospital bed, 8 days felt like almost nothing. It also felt like everything. Conrad. Fletcher's voice dropped into a different register, quieter, something more personal. The tone he used when he was talking to his friend and not his client. How are you holding up? My throat went tight. I looked toward the window and the slow gold of the afternoon light. The kind Vivian always said was the best argument for living in California. The way November light turns warm, as if the year is releasing something it had been gripping too hard. I've been better, I said. I've also been worse. I held that for a moment. Fletcher, thank you for all of it. Don't thank me, he said quietly. Just walk back into that building. After the call, I set the phone on the nightstand and looked at the suit jacket hanging from the closet door. The navy blue one Fletcher had brought over from my house 2 weeks ago, pressed and waiting. I had been looking at it every morning when I opened my eyes. 8 days. I reached over and pulled open the nightstand drawer. Underneath my reading glasses was a folded piece of paper, a note I had written to myself 3 months ago, the morning after Fairfax had searched this room and come up empty. It read, "Do not move first. Wait until they show you everything, then move once." I had waited. They had shown me everything. It was time to move. Not perfectly. 3 months of lying still and eating whatever was set in front of you will do that to a man. The weight comes off in a way that leaves the clothes uncertain. The jacket hung a little loose across the shoulders. The trousers wanted a belt, pulled 1 notch tighter than it had any business being. But it fit well enough, and it was the suit I had worn on the morning I signed Caldwell Freight Solutions' first major carrier contract in January of 1990, and that counted for more than the tailoring. I dressed slowly, deliberately, the way you move when your ribs haven't quite forgiven you yet. Every reach, every turn required a beat of thought before the motion. The nurse who brought my discharge paperwork knocked twice, came through the door, and pulled up short when she found me standing beside the bed in the navy jacket. "You have somewhere to be," she said. Not a question. "I do," I said. She smiled and passed me the forms. I signed them with Ingrid Pelham's approval, which I'd secured the evening before, and she wished me well on her way out. I stood alone in room 412 for a moment once she was gone. 3 months. 91 days. I had come in through the emergency entrance on a Friday morning in September, unable to draw a breath without it costing me something. Now I was walking out through the front lobby on a Wednesday morning in December, in a suit that had seen better decades, but still understood how to hold its shape. I lifted the cardboard box from the chair beside the bed. It wasn't heavy. It had never been heavy. But everything that mattered was inside it. Fletcher was waiting out front in his truck, A sensible, unremarkable vehicle, the sort a man drives when his whole career has been about what things actually accomplish, rather than how they present. He climbed out when he spotted me coming through the lobby doors and moved around to hold the passenger side open without needing to be asked. We didn't talk much on the drive to City of Industry. That was something I had always respected about Fletcher Grady. He knew which mornings weren't for conversation. He drove and I rode with the box across my lap and watched Los Angeles pass outside the glass. The freeways, the overpasses, the industrial stretches. I had spent 35 years learning the way you learn the lines of your own face. When we turned onto the road that runs past the Caldwell Freight Yard, I saw the trucks standing along the east fence, 230 vehicles' engines quiet, waiting for their morning dispatches. Something about the sight of them landed in my chest, in a place I hadn't braced for. Those were my trucks, driven by my people carrying freight that honest men and women had loaded and delivered and logged and signed for every single day, while the machinery above them was being used for something I had spent 35 years trying to stand against. I was going to correct that. Starting in the next 10 minutes. Fletcher pulled into the visitor space near the front entrance. My usual spot was taken, which told me Renata had arrived ahead of us, which was precisely what Zora had anticipated. I got out, straightened the jacket slowly, and looked up at the Caldwell Freight Solutions sign above the entrance. I had watched them mount that sign to the wall 35 years ago. Stood in the parking lot with Vivian next to me, and a thermos of coffee between us, watching the installation crew drive the last bolt into the concrete, and Vivian had taken my hand and said, "There it is, Conrad. There it is." I picked up the box. "Ready," Fletcher said. "No," I said. "Let's go." He held the door. I walked through it. The lobby was quiet. The woman at the reception desk glanced, and her face went wide for just a moment, then smoothed into the careful, neutral expression of someone who had been told not to react. I gave her a nod. She returned it. I took the elevator to the second floor. The conference room door was closed. Through the narrow window set into the frame beside it, I could make out Renata standing at the head of the table, one hand resting on the surface, addressing the assembled board, with the practiced ease of a woman who had been rehearsing this moment for a long time. The presentation behind her showed a restructuring plan. Caldwell Freight Solutions' new management structure, effective immediately. I pushed the door open and walked in. Renata's hands went still. The color drained from her face in one sudden drop, the way a shade gets pulled down over a window. Her lips parted. The room went completely still. "Dad." The word came out broken, barely above a whisper. "You should be resting." I crossed to the center of the table and set the box down. "I've been resting long enough," I said. I did not rush. That was the first decision I had made. When I put that box on the conference table, I was not going to rush. I had waited 91 days for this. The people seated around that table could wait a few more minutes. I opened the box and began laying documents on the surface, one at a time, the way you set down the components of something you are building, not tearing apart. Each stack went down flat, square, and without theater. The room held its silence. 12 board members, Tatichitum, 3 senior managers, Renata at the head of the table. Her hands now wrapped around the back of her chair, knuckles pale against the leather. "The first document," I said, "is the electronic logging device data from 23 Caldwell freight vehicles, covering routes run between September and December of this year." I set the stack down. Under federal law, 49 CFR Part 395, this data cannot be modified or erased. It documents 23 trips with stops at locations that appear in no Caldwell freight client contract. A warehouse in Paris, a cold storage facility in Brooklyn, New York. I reached into the box. The second document is the corporate registration for Sierra Pacific Transport LLC, a Nevada shell company. The beneficial owner, traced through 2 layers of nominee directors and a Delaware holding company, is identified in this trust instrument. I placed it beside the first stack. Sierra Pacific Transport owns the vehicle that struck my truck on the 10 freeway in September. Renata's grip on the chair tightened. I didn't look at her directly. Not yet. The third document is an email chain between Renata Caldwell and a senior associate of Novak Capital Group, detailing the arrangement under which Caldwell freight shipping lanes were redirected to carry undisclosed materials. I set it down. The fourth is a financial transfer record showing $80,000 moved from a Novak Capital Group subsidiary account into the personal account of Dr. Burton Hollis of Huntington Hospital. The first payment was made 3 weeks before my accident. The second came 4 days after my admission. I paused. Dr. Hollis signed the medical assessment supporting the conservatorship petition. He was paid to write it before I was ever hurt. The room had the quality of held breath, the silence of people absorbing something they cannot step back from, still working out what it means. I reached into the box one final time. The last document is a record of $62,000 paid across 18 months to Officer Wade Fairfax of the LAPD Commercial Transport Division. Officer Fairfax has been cooperating with federal investigators since last week. I set it down. Deputy Chief Philip Merritt, whose charitable organization served as an intermediate account for funds generated by this operation, was taken into federal custody this morning. I looked up. I looked at the board members. I looked at the senior managers. And then I looked at Renata. She wasn't looking at the documents. She was looking at me. Her eyes were wet, not streaming, not theatrical, just quietly and entirely full. The way a person's eyes look when they no longer have the strength left to hold something in. One tear traced down her left cheek, and she didn't lift a hand to stop it. "You didn't build this company," I said. My voice came out steadier than I had expected, quieter. "You only used it." The conference room door swung open. Special Agent Zora Asante came in with 2 federal agents at her back. She held a leather folder and wore the expression of someone arriving exactly when they had planned to. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "I apologize for the interruption. Mr. Caldwell, thank you for your patience." She turned to Renata. "Ms. Caldwell, I have a federal warrant for your arrest. Please step away from the chair." Renata didn't argue. She didn't turn for the door or raise her voice or do any of the things a person imagines they might do when a moment like that finally arrives. She simply released the chair, stepped back once, and stood there somehow smaller than she had looked 10 minutes earlier when she'd been commanding the head of that table with the company's future arranged in front of her. What happened at LAX I didn't witness. I learned it afterward from Zora in the same careful second-hand way I'd come to learn most things over those 3 months. Sterling Novak had reached the Tom Bradley International Terminal at 9:45 that morning, carrying 2 bags and a business-class ticket to Zurich. He had moved through security without a hitch. He was seated at the gate scrolling something on his phone when 2 federal agents and a U.S. Marshal closed in from separate directions at once. He looked up. He saw their credentials. And then, for what I imagine was the first time in a very long while, Sterling Novak had nothing left to say. They put him in handcuffs at the boarding gate while the other passengers watched. His leather portfolio, the same style he had carried into my conference room 6 years ago, purchase offer in hand, patient smile in place, was sealed into an evidence bag. He had waited 6 years for the precise moment. He had simply waited a fraction too long. After Zora walked Renata out of the conference room, I went to the window and looked down at the yard below. The trucks were still standing along the east fence, engines off, waiting. Within an hour they would be rolling their routes, the same routes they had run for 35 years, hauling honest freight for honest clients, driven by people who deserved far better than what had been done over their heads. My chest ached. My ribs ached. My throat drew tight until I had to press my lips shut and pull air slowly through my nose. The room behind me cleared in stages. Board members moving toward the door, managers gathering their things. The quiet that settles when something large finally stops. Fletcher appeared beside me at the window. He didn't speak. He just stood there the way he had stood beside me on a highway shoulder in Nevada 30 years ago when my transmission gave out. And we were both too young and too short on money to know things would turn around. They had turned around then. They would turn around now. "She asked about you," I said quietly. Before they took her out, I watched her look back. Fletcher said nothing. He understood the way people who have known you a long time understand that I wasn't talking to him. I was talking to the yard below, to the trucks, to 35 years of something I had built with my hands and had nearly lost to something I had built with my heart. The room felt hollowed out. I lifted the cardboard box from the table lighter, now its contents spread across the surface where 12 board members had read every page, and tucked it under my arm. Then I turned from the window and walked toward the door. Zora Asante found me in the hallway outside the interview suite at 2:47 in the afternoon. I had been sitting in a plastic chair against the wall for the better part of an hour, jacket still on the cardboard box on the floor next to my feet, watching a stretch of fluorescent-lit corridor do nothing in particular. My ribs ached from the morning's effort. My throat carried a tightness that had nothing to do with the injury that had kept me at Huntington Hospital for 3 months. Zora settled into the chair beside mine without being asked. She placed her leather folder on her knees and looked at the same section of hallway I had been staring at. "She talked," Zora said, "before her attorney arrived, against our advice and against the advice of the public defender on duty." She paused. "What she told us was her decision. No one pushed her toward it." "I know," I said. "That's Renata." Zora looked at me then. "Do you want to hear it?" I pressed my lips together, dropped my gaze to the floor, and felt the particular gravity of a question that only has one answer even when that answer extracts something from you. "Yes," I said. Zora opened the folder. She didn't read from it. She had the kind of recall that holds things cleanly without needing the page. She glanced at her notes once, then looked back at the hallway and spoke. Sterling Novak had first approached Renata at the Southern California Logistics Association dinner in the spring of 2022. She hadn't known who he was. Not the name, not his history with her father, not the failed acquisition offer from 2016. He had come to her as a private investor with an interest in the freight industry. Polished, informed, and genuinely attentive to what she had to say. She said she felt he took her seriously. Zora said he treated her like someone who actually understood the business, not like the daughter. I pressed my palm flat against my thigh. Said nothing. Over the months that followed, the relationship became personal. Renata hadn't mentioned him to me because she hadn't mentioned anyone to me. It was a boundary she had kept since her mother died, and I had become, in ways neither of us had entirely admitted, both her parent and her closest confidant. Sterling had been patient. For close to a year, he asked nothing of her professionally. Then, in the spring of 2021, it had started not with demands, but with suggestions. Small ones at first. Conversations about operational efficiency. Questions about which shipping lanes returned the thinnest margins. Renata had answered because she trusted him, and because the questions had seemed genuinely curious rather than purposeful. By the time she began to understand what those questions were assembling, she had already said enough to implicate herself. She tried to walk away twice, Zora said quietly. The first time he reminded her of conversations she had already held with his associates. Exchanges that, stripped of context, would read as though she had been actively recruiting partners for an unauthorized operation. A pause. The second time he told her that if she pulled out, her father would be the one investigators focused on first. That the company records would point to Conrad Caldwell before they pointed to anyone else. My jaw tightened until I felt the pressure at the hinges. She believed him, I said. She was worn down and frightened, and she had been cut off from anyone who might have told her otherwise for the better part of a year. Zora's voice stayed measured and level. That doesn't excuse what she did, but it is the surrounding context. I knew the context. I had been working toward it for 3 months, through every call with Fletcher, every conversation with Ingrid Pelham, every night. I had lain in room 412 turning the question over. Had my daughter entered this of her own choosing, or had she been steered there by someone who had made a career of steering people? The answer I had arrived at was both, and neither. The truth sat in the complicated middle ground between those two things, where a person's own choices and another person's deliberate manipulation overlap until drawing a clean line between them becomes impossible. That didn't make it any easier. If anything, it made it harder. She asked about you, Zora said. I looked up. After she finished talking, before her attorney came in, Zora held my gaze. She asked whether you were all right. Whether you had, she said, come out of this, okay. Something closed in my throat. I looked up at the fluorescent strip above the doorway, pressed the back of my hand against my mouth, and held it there until the tightness moved through. What did you tell her? I said. I told her you were standing up, Zora said. That felt like the most accurate thing I could offer. I nodded and looked back down at the cardboard box on the floor beside my feet. Emptied now, its contents laid out on the conference table where 12 people had read every page. I thought about Renata standing at the head of that table this morning, the company's future in her hands. I thought about her face as Zora led her out the moment she looked back. Not the face of someone caught. The face of someone who had been carrying something crushing for a very long time and had finally, in the worst way imaginable, set it down. I thought about Vivian, about the promise I had made at a kitchen table 22 years ago. I thought about whether this was what keeping that promise looked like, whether being Renata's safe place had ever accounted for the possibility that she might one day need me to be it from a distance through glass after everything had already come apart. I didn't have an answer. I wasn't certain there was one. Thank you, I said to Zora, for telling me. She gave a single nod, got to her feet, and picked up her folder. Your investigator is downstairs. He said to tell you he has the truck running and the heater on. That was Fletcher. 30 years, and he still remembered I ran cold. I lifted the cardboard box and rose slowly, deliberately, the way I'd been getting to my feet for 3 months, straightened my jacket, took one last look at the door of the interview suite behind which my daughter was sitting with her attorney and the ruins of a year's worth of decisions. I didn't go in. I turned and walked toward the elevator. Fletcher was out there in the truck with the engine running and the heat going exactly as he'd promised. I climbed in. Without a word, he handed me a coffee from the place on Larchmont and Beverly. I wrapped both hands around the cup and stared out the passenger window as he pulled out of the parking structure onto the boulevard. Los Angeles drifted past storefronts, pedestrians. The late afternoon light stretched gold and low across the pavement, the way it does in December, when the days are brief and everything seems illuminated from an angle that makes even the ordinary carry some kind of weight. We rode a long time in silence. That was fine. Certain things don't require words between two people who've known each other long enough. Fletcher drove and I held the coffee and watched the city go by, thinking about a woman sitting in a room 2 miles behind us, and a company 30 miles ahead, and 35 years of something I had built that was still standing. It had taken things from me I couldn't recover. It had returned things I hadn't looked for. I held the coffee, let the heat run, watched Los Angeles pass the window, and didn't look away. 6 months is not a long time. It is also not a short one. By June of 2023, Caldwell Freight Solutions was still standing. The federal investigation had worked through its full scope over 4 months. Charges filed, assets, frozen plea agreements, negotiated court dates set. My name had appeared in legal documents more times than I cared to count, always on the right side of the caption, but present all the same. Lionel Haig was still in his office on the second floor. We had brought in an independent audit committee, 3 external accountants, who reviewed every transaction above $10,000. Lionel had put forward the idea himself before I had a chance to raise it. He arrived early and stayed late, same as always, and never once mentioned what it had personally cost him to carry those records through the months when nobody knew he was carrying them. Cecily Dunbar had been promoted to Director of Compliance. She had rebuilt the entire manifest documentation process from scratch. New templates, new verification, new protocols. A direct reporting line to me that cut through every layer between us. She had also, in her first week in the new role, framed the original falsified manifest from September and mounted it on the wall of her office. Not as a trophy, as a reminder. Fletcher Grady had joined the company's advisory board. He made the drive down from Visalia on the first Tuesday of every month, and we had coffee before the meetings, the same way we'd always had coffee, mostly in silence, watching the yard wake up the trucks, pulling out one by one into the morning. The Caldwell Integrity Logistics Foundation opened its doors in April. Small office, 3 staff members, a website that explained in plain language what your rights were if a company tried to seize your freight contract or pressure you into signing something you didn't fully understand. We had helped 11 businesses in the first 2 months. We expected to help more. On a Thursday morning in June, my assistant set an envelope on my desk. The return address was a law office on Wilshire Boulevard I didn't recognize. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded once. 2 words handwritten. I'm sorry. I recognized the handwriting before I understood what I was feeling. The particular way Renata shaped her lowercase letters, the slight leftward tilt she had developed in middle school, and never corrected the way the R in sorry curved upward at the end, as if reaching for something. I sat at my desk for a while. The morning light came through the window the way it does in June. Bright and direct, no marine layer, the kind of Los Angeles morning that makes you understand why people come here and never leave. I folded the letter carefully and opened the desk drawer. There in the back left corner, where I'd kept it for 39 years, was the photograph Renata at 8 years old sitting in the cab of the 1985 Kenworth, grinning at the camera with both hands on the steering wheel and her feet not quite reaching the pedals. I set the letter beside the photograph. Then I closed the drawer. Outside the window, the yard was full, 230 trucks' engines turning over one by one. That particular sound of a freight operation coming to life in the morning. Diesel and air brakes, the distant voice of a dispatcher working through the day's routes. Honest work, honest routes, honest people doing what they had always done. I had built it once. I had kept it. That was enough. I have driven a lot of roads in 67 years, but no road ever broke me the way this one did. This family story taught me something I wish I had learned decades earlier. Love without awareness is just vulnerability waiting to be exploited. I gave my daughter everything, my trust, my company, my silence, and nearly lost all 3. Don't be like me. Don't assume that because someone carries your blood, they carry your values. Family betrayal doesn't announce itself. It arrives in signed documents and reasonable explanations in the voice of someone you would never think to question. I believe God placed the right people around me at exactly the right moment. Lionel with his patience, Cecily with her courage, Fletcher with his loyalty. None of them had to do what they did. They chose to. That is not luck. That is grace. In my honest view, a family story is never just about one family. It is about every person who has ever trusted someone completely and found out that trust carries a price. And family betrayal heals slowly if it heals at all. That is where this road ends. And I want to stay with you here for just a moment before we part ways. This story cost me things I cannot name in a single sentence. It cost me the version of my daughter I had carried in my heart for 40 years. It cost me the certainty that love by itself is enough of a shield. I believe God placed the right people around me at exactly the right moment, Lionel, Cecily, Fletcher, not because I deserved it, but because grace does not wait for you to earn it. What I walked away with was not closure. It was clarity. Here is what I would tell anyone sitting with their own version of this. Do not confuse loyalty with silence. Real loyalty speaks up even when it costs something. If someone uses your trust as a tool, that is not a failure of your love, it is a failure of their character. When you are building something worth protecting, watch who benefits most from your blindness. Family justice does not always arrive the way you imagined it would. Sometimes it arrives in a federal arrest and a quiet drawer you close alone. These are not easy lessons. They are the kind you absorb slowly, long after the courtroom empties and the trucks are back on the road. If you have ever followed one of these dad's revenge stories and wondered whether the ending is worth the cost of getting there, I will tell you, honestly, it depends on what you were willing to carry. I carried a lot. I would do it again. If something in this story stayed with you, leave a comment and tell me what it was. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you want to be here for the next one, subscribe to Wise Revenge. I'll be waiting. Thank you for listening all the way through. Take good care of yourself.